I usually write them out, so I'm just going to
Mhm.
indulge myself real quickly. It's pretty brief. So
Mhm.
I wanted to lay out the premise insofar as I intended for it to be read, that the world and things within it do not exist exclusively in a predetermined state, but have within them the capability for true and unfettered free will. I ultimately fall somewhere into the compatibilist camp. So, really, I think that the argument here is not that nothing is predetermined, but more that only some things are predetermined, and that the system doesn't have to operate in a binary, but can operate on a spectrum. I think one of the really nice things about these kinds of discussions is that there really is not a ton of empirical evidence that indicates whether or not determinism or free will exists. There are maybe some neurological factors that can be considered, but I think that the key point to address here is that in order for determinism to be absolute, it would mean that all actions are predetermined by a series of causalities imparted onto unconscious agents within a system, something akin to a mathematical equation into which variables can be plugged into in an infinite number of ways and still solicit the same outcome, which, unless the solution of the equation is zero, is just not possible. And quite frankly, I don't believe that the existence of causal change or the presence of antecedent causes as a condition of our being is enough to justify absolute determinism. And just to keep this brief, if we were to look at the conditions under which we exist, we would quickly find that ultimately the entirety of any causal chain is unknowable to us as of yet. There is no algorithm, metaphysic, or psychology that can predict the ramifications or consequences of any given set of antecedent events indefinitely into the future. And there are far too many variables in any given action, even something as small as the flap of a butterfly's wings, for us to logically conclude that somehow an external force has predetermined the outcome of any given event or exchange. Because of the unknowability of these things, I think that it really is an ad hoc critique to say, well, everything happenstantially occurred so as to solicit this specific, inevitable, predetermined outcome. This unknowability of the results of interactions would seem to me to imply that there exists no more substantial evidence to suggest that the results of any given set of interactions can be said to have occurred within an absolutely predetermined system than there is evidence to suggest it occurred with libertarian free will of all agents involved. And it is because of this I choose to advocate for the existence of free will rather than the existence of a determined system, because as of yet, there is not one that seems any more likely than the other. And when given the choice pragmatically, I can see no reason to conclude that the system is absolutely predetermined, as it would provide a minimal amount of self-serving optimism by which to hope for potentially better outcomes. And as Nietzsche would ultimately, or as Nietzsche says, would ultimately amount to nothing more than disingenuous nihilism. And
Mm,
that's my opening statement. Thank you
okay.
for indulging me.
No, sure. I do that too. Okay, so what I'm hearing is that you've concluded that free will or determinism, these are things that have a roughly equal probability of being the case, but you prefer the free will version. So you're saying so you take that to be true, not for any epistemic reason, but just because pragmatically, like you prefer it or something, or because it's more useful. Or...
I do believe that it is more useful. I also have a religious reason for believing that free will exists,
Mm-hmm.
because I believe it's one of the primary conditions outlined in the Bible that God creates within our experience of existence. Um, and in addition, I don't know if I would call it so much as of a preference. I think I might have an epistemic leaning towards believing it exists. I just don't think that this is something that you can necessarily prove absolutely. So I prefer not to make too audacious of a claim. That's just kind of my approach to debate in general, is to say well, I believe that this is the case because I believe it to be true in some capacity. Not so much that it's not my absolute conclusion. Does that make sense? I want to be rhetorically open in the way that I address things.
Right. So you're so yeah, you don't want to. You're not making a strong empirical argument. You may have some leanings in either direction, but largely, it's more like we don't really know, but you have some little leanings in that direction, so you end up on that side of the fence. But it's an issue that you don't think there's a strong, clear answer for epistemologically.
Yeah, I would
Mm-hmm.
say that. And I would say that about most things that I discuss as far as philosophy is concerned. There's really no strong answer for any of them. But
Yeah.
that's a whole different discussion in itself.
Mm. So to be clear, I want to clarify what exactly you mentioned. Libertarian free will. Is that what you're espousing here?
I would say that like the idea of libertarian free will is a representation of some of the kinds of free will that exist within the system. So
Okay.
when I put the prompt out there, my thought was that someone who wasn't an absolute determinist or some variation of a determinist would take the prompt, and then we would discuss determinism versus compatibilism.
I see. Um, so, but we may end up doing that. But can you explain to me? So, hmm, interesting. So you're saying that there are other forms of free will besides libertarian free will that you think also exist within the universe?
So the basis that I'm kind of going off of is a little bit of like Hume, I think is the guy's name. And what he
Mm.
basically said, he's the one who used that specific term antecedent occurrences or antecedent actions. Thank you. Sorry. Why am I thanking myself? Antecedent actions. Uh, so what he was saying is that just because there exists a chain of causality that influences the outcomes of certain interactions or certain exchanges doesn't mean that that interaction or exchange was necessarily predetermined. And so I would say as long as there exists factors within the conditions of our being that are imparted onto us without active choice, there is a form of determinism that exists in the world. So if I genetically inherit a proclivity for alcoholism from my parents, that is a determinist thing. It is predetermined that I will have a proclivity for alcoholism because of something that was outside of my realm of conscious choice. So I can't advocate for an entirely libertarian free will system as long as I hold that premise. So I would say that free will exists in different forms on a spectrum. Some things are more predetermined and some things are less predetermined. And there are a few things that are completely not determined.
Mm. So the proposition here, correct me if I'm wrong, is that some form of free will exists. So in order for me to show that this is false, I have to disprove the existence of any of the kinds of free will that you're proposing exist, right? Like all of them. I have to do it for each one, correct?
I mean, I wouldn't say we have to go through each one individually.
Okay.
Like, I'm not going to make you do that.
Okay.
I think that would be silly. I like to approach debate with an open discussion, and I want my mind to be changed ultimately. I mean, not really, because I would hate it if the world was predetermined, but like, but yeah, I'm not going to make you go through each one. I think really, I would feel satisfied if you were able to say like, well, the idea of free will itself is insubstantial or it's ludicrous or it has no backing. So I'd be okay if we could go there. I'm not going to ask you to like disprove every form of free will that I believe exists. You can just say the
Mhm.
spectrum doesn't exist, and I'd be satisfied with that.
Right. Yeah. Hmm. So my general view about determinism is that it's impossible for everything to be predetermined, it seems to me. It seems impossible that everything can be predetermined because I mean it's just you have to keep kicking the can down the road infinitely. You get an infinite regression. I'm not sure that that can exist. It's yeah, it seems about as impossible as anything is. Um, but that being said, that doesn't mean that we have free will. Um, and so, like, if we say that, for example, it could be the case that it could easily be the case that there are probabilistic events or possibly even completely random events occurring at the scale of, quantum events and things like that, that would manifest on higher scales as deterministic appearing events and phenomena. Um, but this would still, because we are operating at the level of those higher events, I would say that this would constitute a kind of a refutation of free will in terms of like if all the high scale events were or the large scale events were deterministic, then I would say that we don't really have free will in that case. But then saying that, there are the two kinds of kind of free will that I've heard about, and the one I think is what is meant by libertarian free will, and the other one is more the one that I guess you could always argue exists, which is the kind of like, machines make decisions, and in the same sense, humans make decisions and animals make decisions. They select actions, and they have a conscious sort of, there's a qualia about their consciousness that makes it feel like they are making choices that they could have like counterfactually chosen not to make. So it definitely,
It's
there's
an
definitely,
evolutionary function of the brain to incline the creature to thinking that it made the decision itself, right? Am I understanding you correctly?
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's at least a sensation of free will, but when it comes to counterfactually, could there have been another decision made by anything? That is kind of what I view to be the essence of the free will debate. Is if you are a proponent of free will in kind of the pure sense, in the sense that I think kind of captures the real essence of the word, or the term, then you're thinking that that given some action made by some agent, uh, the agent could have chosen a different action. But my view is that in the moment when you are about to make an action, um, uh, the choice that you will make is theoretically determined. Not in the sense that we know what's going to happen, of course, but in the sense that there's not more than one possibility. If we knew everything, then there would be some action with a certain that was certain to happen. Now, you've mentioned the argument that like, is there actually any evidence for determinism being true? Is there any evidence for that? And there are circumstances where we do have a large degree of predictive power,
Mm-hmm.
and it increases with the control that we have. It increases in negative proportion to the complexity of the situation, essentially. But in those
Right.
circumstances where there's like a pretty simple situation and we know a lot about it, we seem to be able to predict the outcome very accurately. Now, agreed, like you throw a ball up into the air. So there's many calculations, many like small factors that you're not certain uh, what's affecting what. There's some main factors, gravity and air resistance, and trajectory and things like that, that you can say these things are the things we're actually taking into account. These are the main things that affect the motion of the ball, and so we have a pretty good approximation of what's happening with the ball. But I do grant that there are other factors that influence that. I mean, even when you throw a ball like 10 feet in the air, there is a Coriolis effect. And there are other factors that, things other than air moving through the atmosphere, touching the ball. There are the rotation of the ball interacts with the air particles in ways that aren't represented by the simplification model of the ball as just a particle. There's things like that, right? And it's like, well, it is a bit of a stretch to say that like the only way you could prove determinism is we've taken all the factors into account and we're able to determine exactly what's going to happen in this case. That's the only way that something could actually be very strong evidence for determinism, because otherwise you could observe the same phenomena or
Right.
phenomenon with there being some small random or probabilistic fluctuations that don't affect the phenomenon at the scale that we're perceiving it, right? But yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think one of the issues that I'm kind of taking with what it is that you're saying is that I feel like you're conflating the existence of free will within like particles and the laws of physics with the existence of free will within agents. So I wouldn't say that like so you were saying we can predetermine the outcomes of a lot of different things, right? So I know that if I put water into a tank and I perform the act of electrolysis, that I can separate the hydrogen atoms from the oxygen atoms, right? Well, technically it's a hydrogen molecule because it's H2, right? It doesn't occur on its own. I know that that is the case. And as you said, as you increase the complexity of an interaction, the likelihood of being able to predict the outcome of it has a negative relationship with that. So I think that saying that, well, free will doesn't exist within the way or the system of physics that we understand the world to operate by, because it doesn't exist there, we also can say that it doesn't exist within ourselves, because perhaps we would conclude our brain is a function of physics in some capacity. And I would say, like, we don't currently have a way to prove that. And if we did have a way to prove that, this argument would be null and mute, right? But it also feels like a cop out to say, well, you can't prove that that isn't the case, therefore I win, right? That doesn't feel right to me as far as like a satisfactory answer. And I also think that's a logical fallacy of some sort, but I can't remember which one. So, but I would say I do agree with you. If the argument would be that we are basically pre-programmed and operating from a set of limited selections for potential actions within the world, and we're operating from this limited selection and we're only choosing from a certain list, that in itself is not libertarian free will. But I would say that there are a few instances in which libertarian free will can exist, but there's really no way to prove it, because ultimately we as observing agents in this world like to look back at causal chains to see how it is that something came into being or came into occurrence, right? We want to look at World War II and say, well, how is it that the Nazis ended up where the Nazis were? Or we want to look at the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and say, how is it that the Khmer Rouge was able to murder thousands of educated people right underneath their noses? Like, how is it that they were able to do that? We want to look at that as if there is a causal chain that determined the outcome. But I think that's ad hoc. I think that that's looking at something after something has, or looking at a situation after it has occurred and saying, well, it occurred because of XYZ, therefore it was determined. But it's just happenstantial that all of those causalities led into one another. It's not as if we can say that they absolutely existed in a chain that would result in like an equation, like I was saying earlier, right? I can't say that Neville Chambers or Chamberlain, I can't remember his name, acted in a way that appeased the Nazis and allowed for them to grab XYZ countries, and then add in that Hitler was able to levy the blame for Germany's economic downturn onto the Jewish people, and so on and so forth. Therefore, World War II happened. Like, I can't say that those things all happened within a predetermined system, because ultimately that's ad hoc. That's applying like exterior knowledge to a situation.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. It's projecting, it's confirmation bias, it's hindsight bias, it's all of those things.
Right.
And yeah, you can't do that. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, and I was just saying, and because of that, I would say that when we look at the actions of individual agents, we would say the same thing. Like, ultimately, I can look at, let's say, early eugenicists in the 20th century. They were super racist, so please don't think that I support these ideas. They're just ideas that I'm aware of. I want to make that clear. There was this gentleman who was studying a family by the name of the Kallikak family. And the Kallikak family was a family from the Appalachians who was inbred, and they were very predisposed to certain behaviors that were viewed as negative. And this eugenicist who was studying this family said, well, it's predetermined that they're going to be this way. The people who are born into this will be this way. And that, you know, obviously, like, racist, classist, all sorts of stuff that I don't agree with. But the argument was that they would be that way. But he's just looking at all these external factors as if those factors themselves are predetermined in some capacity, when ultimately that's just a broad generalization that doesn't, to me, provide satisfactory justification for the idea of complete determinism. Like I said before, I won't say that there is nothing that is predetermined. I don't think that's any more able to be supported than the idea that everything is predetermined. I think they're both equally insubstantial arguments. That's part of why I would believe so much in compatibilism, that it presents the most logically sound way by which to look at the world, and it doesn't necessarily fall in the middle either. So it doesn't hit, what is that, middle ground fallacy or something like that. I do think it's a kind of an intellectual cop out, but I still think that it's worthwhile.
Yeah, so I think when we talk about free will and we talk about determinism, or we talk about sort of randomness, I think we've got to move from asking for proofs to just probabilistic arguments, because I think it's impossible to prove either determinism or randomness, because I've already explained why I think you can't prove determinism. In fact, I think that it's impossible for ultimate determinism to occur, but it's in fact impossible for no, interesting. Okay, so it's impossible for small scale there's an interesting way. It's impossible for any given action to be ultimately predetermined, because you just can't. Yeah, at some point you have to stop. And then when it comes to talking about large scale events versus small scale events, large scale events, you could say, are deterministic, in the sense that not that they were originally caused by some infinite chain or something, but in that there are things that caused them with probability 1, and it doesn't matter if they were caused by things that were caused by things that were caused by things with a probability of 1, kind of thing. It doesn't matter if you don't have to propagate that back the whole way, but just locally you can have events that are determined with a high probability. So I think that's possible, but you can't prove. Can you prove that it's the case? If you have you can increase the probability of knowing that you can have a probabilistic argument for it, but if you have
I think I think you're operating at a disadvantage using the word probabilistic, because probabilistic doesn't imply an absolute outcome. In itself, the word implies that it is a likely outcome. So there's I don't even know if there's such a thing as 100% probability necessarily. I don't think that that's the way that the math functions for that type of math. I'm not totally sure. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But I do think that in order to prove determinism, if you're using the word probability, then ultimately you're kind of operating from a not advantageous state for that.
Yeah, sure. I'm just trying to figure out. There's this weird sort of distinction in my mind between ultimate determinism versus local determinism versus this weird scale distinction. I'm just trying to get it clear in my head so I know what I'm talking about. But I definitely would say that it's impossible to know if something is random, because of course you could always have something that caused the randomness, right? So I don't think it's possible to know for sure if things are ultimately deterministic or ultimately random. But then I would say that there are ways that you can argue for determinism with respect to actions, like large-scale events, human actions, human decisions, because there's for example, you can have this hypothesis, which is that all events are all events on a human scale, on a largish sort of scale, are predetermined, and you can accrue evidence for that fairly easily by determining specific instances in which things are determined on this level, and so anytime then you find a circumstance where something has been shown to be predetermined, that adds evidence for human actions being predetermined as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can, and also anytime we find that something, yeah, well, I mean, it's the same. It's the same. It's two sides of the same coin. Anytime you see something that doesn't have free will, it decreases the probability that humans have free will. Um, by
I see what you're
phase
saying.
theory.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I agree that you could it's entirely possible for most things, physical phenomena, things that you could find out in a laboratory, for those things to be predetermined, but for human brains to have something special. But they're still not exempt from the probability, from the impact of the evidence from the other more natural quote unquote phenomena, right?
Yeah.
So I would say that there's a fair bit of evidence for that on the large scale. You know, I don't have a lot of examples, but I'm sure, like from our human experience, I'm sure you and I both know a lot of have observed a lot of evidence of things being quite closely predictable, and so every
Yeah.
such instance is evidence towards there not being free will.
Yeah. I will say, so I would generally agree with you. The idea that if we can find instances within the laws of physics, the laws by which we understand existence around us to operate under, if we can find instances there where factors can be introduced that will cause as far as we know, an axiomic reaction, that it would suggest that if our brain operates with those same functions, which we can mostly prove that it does based off of the way that science has indicated that brains work, then it would be evidence against the idea that humans have free will. I think that something that might undermine that a little bit is that ultimately the level of complexity within the mind is something that we don't even comprehend yet. The number of potential connections, occurrences, transfers of information that can happen within the brain is, as far as we're concerned right now, seemingly infinite. And in addition to that, so we might be able to observe phenomena in a very basic way, right? So, like the example that I gave earlier, the hydrolysis thing, right? But when we
Mm-hmm.
look at things on a more granular level, when we start to reduce them further, there is a phenomena in quantum physics called, what is it? The influence of the observer or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's an experiment that they ran where they shot photons at a photon sensitive screen, and the photons were invisible to the naked eye. So they shot photons at the screen, and when they observed the photons being shot, they appeared in a pattern that they were able to predict pretty accurately based on the type of photon. But when they ran the machine without the presence of the observer, they just ran the machine and left, those patterns no longer appeared. Different
Mm-hmm.
patterns appeared. So I would say that as you get down further into the level of quantum observance, there's more evidence to suggest that there might be something different going on, or that our act of observing in itself is a factor that's being introduced into the outcome of certain things. And that is probably or fall into your statement about probabilities, right? So it is more probable that something will occur if an observer is present for a particular phenomena. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's absolute, because clearly there exists other ways in which those photons could behave. So it's just probabilistic that they're occurring in the way that they're occurring when we're observing. It's not absolute. It's just that the probability becomes much higher. And I would say not necessarily insurmountable.
So you're saying that if you have an observer watching the photons being shot, it's possible for them to behave in the way that we normally see them behave when there is not an observer?
Yeah. Yeah, I
But
think that there's a possibility.
yeah, okay, yeah.
But
There's a
that's what I was saying earlier
possibility, right?
about that being a disingenuous statement, because it's like, well, until it's proven, we can't disprove it, right? Because ultimately what I'm saying is, well, until you can show me that it will never ever do that at infinity, there's no way for you to say that it won't happen, and that just feels
Yeah,
disingenuous to
but
me.
you can say that there's a high probability of it. Like the thing is like depending on the arguments we go down, we can always say that we don't we don't know anything for certain, and everything's just in terms of probabilities. Even when we take generous axioms, we still only have probabilities. But I would say that for the sake of the argument, I think it's probably okay if we say that there's a 95% chance of determinism being the case and only a 5% chance of free will existing. I'd say that's sufficient, right?
I wouldn't. I might say that for particles. I wouldn't say that for human beings. I think that you could look at the likelihood of determinism uh, as a or has as having a direct correlation to the complexity of the system in which the thing is operating. And so, because we are a giant, complex network of physical as in physical functions that end up being conflated into one being, because we're so complex, the likelihood of our existence being predetermined uh, decreases substantially. Whereas if we were more simple, the likelihood of our actions being able, or of our existence being predetermined, would become much more likely.
Uh,
Maybe not
I'm
existence,
not
our
sure if that
actions.
I'm not sure if that's true. Can you explain the probability argument there for me?
Yeah. Um, so if we're going to look at the way that like electricity runs, since brains operate on electricity, right? Electricity
Hmm.
runs along a current, right? It runs through a conductor and it will behave in a predictable way because the operation of electrical energy is to do blank, right? And
Okay.
if we're going off of the way that we talked about probabilities earlier, then it's probable that it's going to do that. Well, electricity is just a form of energy that's moving through certain things. So it's very simple. But when we look at the way in which the human mind functions, we have thousands and thousands. I think it might, I don't even know if it's millions. I'm not totally sure of potential conduits by which that electricity can travel. So the complexity of that system is much more substantial than the complexity of like the wiring inside your house, for instance. So I can predict the way in which electricity will travel inside my home, but I can't predict the way in which electricity will travel within a human being.
Hmm.
So the
That
likelihood of it being predetermined becomes less.
um okay, so what I got from that was I heard a good argument for saying that the human brain is much more complex than like the electricity routes through a household. And
Mm-hmm.
then I agree that that makes it, roughly proportionally more difficult to determine what's going to happen. Can you explain to me how you go from there to saying that it's more that is like therefore the complexity of the brain is like counter evidence for it being predetermined?
Yeah, I was operating based off of the idea. So we were talking about probability and saying that probability being greater was, at least I interpreted your argument as being the probability of something being greater means that it is more likely that that thing is predetermined, because we've already agreed that we can't prove that it's predetermined or absolutely free will. We can't prove either way. So we were operating on what's more likely. And so I was trying to counter the argument because I felt like you said, if something is more likely to be predetermined, then we ought to conclude that it is. And so if the human mind is much more complex and therefore less likely to be predetermined, we ought to conclude that free
Mm.
will is more likely. That
Right,
that
right,
was what
right.
I was
That,
operating on.
that's
I apologize if I didn't get that. If I
no,
didn't
no,
make
no,
that
no.
clear.
That's fine. I just I don't understand why you believe that the complexity of the mind makes it less likely for it to be predetermined. That's the thing I don't understand.
Oh
Like I
well, because
understand, yeah.
the number of outcomes, because of the complexity, the number of outcomes that are possible increases dramatically. So much so that we can't like with 100% reliability predict them. And until we can 100% reliably predict them, there's no way for us to prove that there is no free will present within that system. And I think an argument that you made earlier is that, like, well, there's still randomness within a predetermined system, right? So it's not that someone is suddenly going to develop psychic powers and be able to like telepathically bring their water bottle to themselves and drink water out of it.
Yeah.
And so, right, so there's a limitation within the system under which you can operate. But I would say that just because there's a limitation within the system, or limitation within the
Oh, of course.
conditions of a thing's existence, doesn't preclude the existence of some form of free will. It is compatible that there is a system under which we are bound,
Yeah. No,
in
that
which
makes
free will can still
yeah.
fully exist.
That makes sense to me. Of course, you got a room. You can't go beyond the bounds of the room, but you can move around freely within it. Like that, sure, 100%. But I don't. Okay, so let's just go over that argument for the probability being like the complexity of the brain, making it less likely for it to be predetermined again. So the idea is that if something is more complex, there are more possible outcomes. So that, to me, I feel like where you're going with this is that positive evidence for it being predetermined becomes weaker, because when we so the way that we would get positive evidence about it happening like directly would be something like we make a prediction, some particular prediction about what's going to happen, and um, it happens to happen, then that would be evidence for it being predetermined, but the probability of that happening is much lower in a complex mind, so therefore it's less probable for the mind to be predetermined. Is that the argument?
Yeah, well, because I felt like the only way by which we might be able to ascribe deterministic outcomes to things is if we can predict outcomes. Because like I said earlier,
Yeah,
to
I
say
see.
that, well, this solicited this thing is ad hoc. It doesn't hold any water, in my opinion, right?
No.
So we
I
would have
see.
to be able to apply variables that would allow us to predict the outcome of something. If we can do that,
Yeah.
then we can say it's more predetermined, or it's more likely that it's predetermined.
Yeah, because if we found something, some predictive model, and then we actually applied it and it worked, then we can say, well, yeah, it's predicted by this. Like this is the thing that it's predicted by right here. So you're not just saying it's predicted by something, you're saying it's predicted by this particular thing. But the thing is that the weight of evidence is actually proportional to the complexity of something, not negatively proportional. Like if you have like a complex system and you're able to predict accurately what happens, that evidence for that hypothesis being the case, like you've got a hypothesis that you're working with and you use it to make predictions about the system. If the system is more complex and you get a correct prediction, then that correct prediction is much stronger evidence for your hypothesis than it would be if the system was less complex. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and I would agree with that statement completely. Yeah, because it becomes more difficult to predict the outcome based off of the complexity of a thing.
Yeah, it becomes less likely that you would get that outcome if your hypothesis wasn't correct. So therefore, like in the same measure, it becomes more likely that it becomes stronger evidence that we get the right thing because our hypothesis was correct, and we've got the right hypothesis, kind of, right?
Yeah, yeah, and you can see this in psychology, right? So, um, there's a phenomena that's currently happening within. Also, I apologize if you hear a lot of noise. I'm outside, and there's a weird bug making a noise. So, this is being recorded. um, there's this odd phenomena that's occurring currently called the replication crisis, where psychologists are finding it really difficult to replicate the outcomes of certain experiments that they've done in the past. And in addition to that, when psychologists have gone back and studied the conditions under which certain tests were applied, they've found that the conditions were tampered with far more than the individuals who made the claims either admitted to or were aware of. One example of this is the phenomena that has occurred where a lot of psychological studies have been completed by students who were willing to volunteer for them because they all occurred within the world of academia in colleges, which were predominantly white at the time that they were doing these experiments, which were predominantly a certain age group, so on and so forth. And so
Yeah.
when we go to attempt to replicate the results of these experiments, what they're finding is that it's almost impossible to do so. So all of these axiomatic things that we were operating under as far as psychology is concerned, were completely false. So
Hmm.
the Stanford prison experiment is an example of this that a lot of people might be more familiar with. Like ultimately, the person who did that experiment believed that they were being very objective, they had a control group, et cetera, right? But like when you look at the way that they actually selected the people within that study, you find that that's not true. They did select certain people, and I would say um, as you as you acquire more factors that are determined in advance, as in like they are the way that they are, and then you attempt to experiment with them, the outcomes that you are able to derive from them are less likely to be universal or true or indications of
Yeah.
deterministic outcomes. So, like, if I am a psychologist and I say I want to figure out what it's like for people who for abandoned children. This was a study in psychology that they did. I believe in a lot of it was in Russia because there were a lot of children who were feral, right? So feral children. They did a bunch of studies on feral children, and they were trying to make like conclusions about the psychology of human beings based off of those. But the issue that I would find with that, or for it to be an indicator of determined behaviors, uh, I think the issue that I find with that is that they're selecting from a group of individuals who have a certain kind of other predetermined factors about them beforehand. And while we
Hmm.
might be able to draw conclusions about common things between all of these individuals who were quote unquote feral children, that doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome of that is predetermined. It just means that within the sample size that you were able to acquire, it is the case that these things were common or that these things are more likely. But it doesn't mean that they're absolute. And the same thing could be said of most behaviors. I might be able to gather up a bunch of white kids who are 22 at a college who want to earn $50 over a weekend and have them do the Stanford prison experiment. And it is much more likely that I'll get the outcome that I get because of all those other factors that played into it beforehand. But that doesn't mean that the outcome was predetermined. It just means that the outcome was more likely based off of the factors that were present in the initial experiment.
Hmm. Yeah,
So I would,
definitely.
yeah, and I would say that like if that would be something that you would lean on for to example as evidence of being
Yeah.
able to predict behaviors, that it ultimately is not as substantial as you would want it to be because you're
Hmm.
operating from all of these other factors that you have no control over that we could say are random or we could say are predetermined, but the outcome of
Hmm.
them is ultimately going to be weighted by the fact that it was these particular kind of predetermined things that were interacting with each other. So
Yeah.
we can't
I,
say that it disproves free will.
Yeah, of course. If you have some research findings that were generated using a sample that isn't representative of the application that you're using it for, then it's much less strong evidence. It's still evidence, but it's not nearly as strong for sure. But just to be clear, so earlier you were saying that the brain being more complex is serves as counter evidence for it being predetermined. Now,
Mhm.
I hope that I'm not sure if you followed me entirely, but I hope that
I think I
I
did.
clearly,
Go ahead.
okay, so yeah, okay, so I think you and I hopefully now agree that it being more complex doesn't weaken, but rather strengthens any evidence that there is in favor of it. But at the same time, uh, but at the same time, you were claiming that it's the complexity decreases the probability of it being predetermined, but it does increase the weight of all of the evidence for it. So why do you believe, or do you still believe that the complexity of the brain makes it less likely for it to be predetermined? What's the
Yeah.
argument for that?
So I would say that the complexity of the brain makes it less likely that the evidence that we would cite as being a predictive factor or a predictive outcome, it makes it less likely that that evidence is true. So it undermines the probability of the evidence being able to be substantial because it's so complex and there are so many things that go into it. So, like the reason I brought up psychology, right? So, like, let's say that you do a psychological experiment, you come to a conclusion in which you were able to predict the behavior of a bunch of people, and you say, well, I've been able to predict all these people based off of all these factors. Therefore, it is more likely things are predetermined than it is that they are. It is that free will exists. But what I would say is that the complexity of all of the factors involved decreases the likelihood of your evidence being substantial enough to be true, because there's so many other complexities that go into the things that contribute to the conclusion that you're making being true. Because there's so
Yeah,
many. Do you see what I'm saying? I keep on rephrasing the same thing. I apologize. I have a tendency to blather every now and then.
I think I understand. So it's more about it's not so much saying that if the evidence is accurate, how strongly does that affect the hypothesis? It's more like it makes it less likely that the evidence is actually true in the first place. It makes it less likely that, like if we say that people have this probability of zapping people when the researcher tells them to, and we say, well, there's this high probability, so we say that this is a degree of predictability, so it's evidence for, it's counter evidence against free will. But you would say, well, the evidence, the complexity of the brain makes it so that it's less likely that that outcome is actually even true. It's less likely that there is that probability. Sure, we observed that probability with this sample. However, the complexity of the brain makes it more likely that the sample was not representative of all people, or that
Right.
it representative of people at all times and in all circumstances and so on. Am I correct?
Yeah. Yeah, and unless you can prove that it is truthful of something in all examples at all times for all purposes, then I would say you can't discount the possibility of free will. And then we would go back to our example that we stated earlier, where it was if something is 95% able to be predicted and only 5% of it is not able to be predicted, we would logically conclude it's more likely that it's determined. But with human beings, as the as the sample size increases, the predictability decreases, and therefore it would become more likely, based off of the conclusion that we drew earlier, that we ought to believe that free will exists.
Mm, yeah. Okay. Sure. Sure. So I'm not actually really. I wasn't planning on using evidence from psychological studies, um, really, but I
I
I
wasn't.
sort
I
of I
wasn't
see
planning
what
on it
you're saying
either.
though. Yeah. 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 I see the point. I'm not entirely sure that follows, but I'm not sure that we should spend much more time on it. So, but my argument is largely that. Uh, I need to go over this with myself a little bit. So the probability, if we see some event being deterministic, it seems deterministic on a large scale, at least in nature, other than in the human mind. Is that evidence for the human mind being deterministic as well? Well, there's a hypothesis that all things are deterministic, including the human mind, and that hypothesis is strengthened by it. But there's also this other hypothesis, which is that the everything is deterministic except the human mind, for example, and that is
Mhm.
equally strengthened by it. So it's not actually relevant evidence. It's evidence against other
Yeah.
things, but it's not evidence with respect to the argument that we're having.
Right.
Um, hmm, Yeah, the only thing is, I would say that it is equal evidence for those things. So, yeah, no, the evidence is irrelevant. The only thing to consider is the prior probability of these things, I would say. Um, because, well, no, but you could, I guess, yeah, so I guess it is, you do want to talk about psychological findings, don't you? You want to talk about the predictability of human behavior.
Um,
Um,
because I don't think that you can necessarily. I don't think you can completely eliminate the existence of determinism in some capacity, right? There are
no,
things that are determined, but that the existence of things that are determined doesn't preclude the existence of complete and total free will. And I don't
no, and
think
it's,
that
I don't
even
think it's relevant evidence. It's not relevant evidence either. Yeah.
right. And to say that something is random is ad hoc, in my opinion, in the same way that saying that something is determined is ad hoc.
Yep.
Like, because we say it's random based off of XYZ, but we could also say it's determined based off of XYZ, depending on who it is that's observing and what conflations they're drawing between two things. It might be
Hmm.
that Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings based off of World War I, or it might be that Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings based off of XYZ. But neither Tolkien nor us can tell us why it is that Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. But if I look at the probabilities, it's more likely, in my opinion, that there at least existed the perception of free will by Tolkien. And if the perception is there, then I would be inclined to think that based off of our consciousness, we have free will. But that doesn't necessarily mean that free will exists entirely, which I think we could maybe dig into that. Is like, does free will exist entirely outside of conscious or subconscious factors?
Yeah, I think we're going to have a couple chapters to this debate here. I've got a couple angles here, but so the first thing was, what is the available evidence? And at least as far as external, like mind external evidence goes, I think it's irrelevant. So I'm interested. We may come back to mind internal evidence, but for now, I'd like to move on to the prior probabilities. So
Yeah.
it seems to me that the claims here are, at least like on the one hand, the claim is that things are deterministic. Everything is deterministic. And the other claim is that seems to be a less. It's just the claim that human. No. Okay, so I'm talking about the claim with respect to the evidence that we were talking about. So we were talking about like, okay, it seems like the evidence is irrelevant because the claims there are claims that include there are claims for which the evidence is evidence that support both sides of this argument. But we have to actually keep using those hypotheses going forward. Otherwise, I believe the evidence will become relevant again. So basically, the point is that is your hypothesis that some things in the world are deterministic, but that the human mind is not? Or
no, I think that I would have to say that I think that there is a possibility that anything could be not predetermined, but that it is especially more likely that the human mind is not predetermined. So it is like we were talking about probabilities earlier of the outcome of like chemical reactions, right? We can predict those with an incredible amount of accuracy. But we can't necessarily predict with the same level of accuracy the outcomes of the human mind or of genetics or of things like that. So I would say that there are occurrences in which certain things will behave in certain ways that could be indicative of free will, in quotes, as much as a particle could have free will. There are certain ways in which those things will behave, in which that it would indicate that they have free will, but it's much more likely that humans are the ones that are going to impart free will into the system more frequently.
okay. Well, yeah, okay. So the point that I'm trying to make, I guess, is that it seems that prior probability wise, it's more likely for everything to be predetermined than for everything other than human minds to be predetermined. Does that make sense to you, first of all?
Yeah, and I could agree with that because I don't feel like it undermines the premise of what it is that I was trying to say, which is that some form of free will exists somewhere in the system.
Hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I guess, but whatever the part of this, so there are parts of the system that we can say it seems like they don't have free will. It seems like some parts of the system are predetermined. So for any part of the system that you were postulating might have free will, the hypothesis in question would be everything has free will except for this thing. And and to be clear, this sounds, as I say it, it sounds like this might be a fallacious argument. So I'm not sure if this works, but this is what I feel like might be the case. So like whatever particular exemption you were thinking there might be, the hypothesis in question would be like everything is predetermined except for this thing which has free will, which is more complex a hypothesis than everything is predetermined. Does this hold water, do you think?
Can you say it one more time?
Um, so my original point was like
Uh-huh.
it sounds like we're making an exception for the human mind. So saying that everything is predetermined except the human mind is more complex and therefore less likely in prior probability than that everything is predetermined. But then you were like, well, I'm not saying in particular that necessarily it's just the human mind and nothing else is. I'm more saying that so there's some free will somewhere, right? So it is harder for me to make that kind of argument there, but I was trying to generalize it so that it's like, well, whatever it is that you're claiming you believe has free will, you think that there's free will somewhere, whatever it is in question that you think has free will, it's always going to be subject to the formulation of like the claim being uh, everything is predetermined except for this thing. Does that make sense? And that's going to be less probable. It's more complex.
Right. So and we were talking earlier about the likelihood of a thing occurring being directly correlative to the complexity of that thing. So if you're saying, or if I were to say, yes, the
Mm-hmm.
likelihood of the human brain being the exclusive agent of free will
Mm-hmm.
in the realm of existence is a much more complex hypothesis than it would be to say that everything is determined or everything isn't determined, because what I'm claiming, or what I could be claiming if I said that, is more complex. It is in fact less likely, which is why I would say I do think that free will exists in some form available to all things,
Yeah, I
perpetrated
see.
by a more complex system.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh. Yeah, it sounds like the prior probability on the face of it, without taking into account anything, your claim seems more simple. Saying there's some free will somewhere sounds like it's simpler than there is no free will anywhere. But it's more like linguistic simplicity. I'm not sure that it's actual like physical and or information theory simplicity. Um,
Right. Yeah, it's more of a like a metaphysics type thing. Yeah, it's. I only laughed because you said linguistic. Um, there's a gentleman who I know outside of the server. His name is Walt. He's in the audience actually, and he's always getting on me about how you're operating on linguistic stuff. So that was why I laughed. I wasn't. I just wanted to be clear.
No, that's fine. Dude. Yeah, okay. So maybe the probability route isn't the way to go. Maybe I should be just attacking the concept of free will. Let's go over there for a while. We may circle back if this doesn't work. But
That's fine with me, man.
okay, yeah, okay. So let's try that one. So the conception of free will is that there is uh, there's some soul, maybe? Is it just randomness, or is it that there's some soul that makes decisions, but it's not determined and it's not random? What's the conception here?
So the conception that I would have of free will is that things act in a way that is counterintuitive to the probability of them acting another way. It would be the most basic way that I could attempt to describe it. So, like, if it is predictable that something will do, the two things interacting will solicit X product, the probability of that is 99.9999999 whatever percent, right? Free will is that 0.0000001% occurrence of that thing happening.
Okay,
So,
so free will to you is correct me if but the thing about so are you talking when you talk about probability, are you talking about like some kind of metaphysical probability, like a frequency, or are you talking about like degree of belief, degree of justified belief? Like, are you talking about like a Bayesian probability, or are you talking more about like a frequency-based probability?
let me look up Bayesian real quick, just because I've heard the name,
Mhm.
but
It's basically
yes,
like,
okay.
yeah, okay,
I just saw it. Yeah, someone did a debate on it earlier this week. I thought it was fascinating.
nice.
Um,
What was the debate about?
I can't remember, man.
Oh,
Oh, it was the change my mind thing that I did the other day with what was his name? I can't remember his name, but he said
Yeah.
it was the existence of God
Oh,
is more likely because of the existence of creation or something like that. And he was using the Bayesian model.
yeah. Who was that guy? Strange.
That wasn't you, was it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Oh my God. That's hilarious. That's so fucking funny. Oh man. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Uh, that's so funny. Okay, explain to me exactly what you mean by the Bayesian model in this particular instance, because I'm not quite drawing the two together. I apologize. I'm not very familiar.
It doesn't matter. I'm just like asking you, like, when it comes to, like, when you say that there's like this 99.999% of something occurring, but the free will is the 0.0001% of it occurring, right? Like, when you talk about the probabilities there, are you talking about, like, there's a few conceptions about what probability is, and one of
Right.
them, the Bayesian one, is that it represents the degree of belief which is justified, and another one
Ah,
is that it's that it's the frequency with which it occurs, or the
it's like a
propensity.
mathematical versus a
Yeah.
justifiable belief, right?
Sort of. They're both mathematical, but they're basically like interpretations of the numbers, largely.
Right.
Yeah.
Interpretations of the data. As if one is axiomic, one is based off of of likelihood. It's a further chain of probability. It is more likely, so I believe. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um. hmm. I
I
feel like
guess.
both would be. I feel like both could be substantial. I don't like to make claims that things exist like axiomically in that fashion. So I would lean more towards the idea of it being a Bayesian conclusion in this particular instance, where it's like it is because of the probability being XYZ that I am more likely to interpret the data to have concluded the following thing or the preceding thing, rather.
Yeah, well, I may have misrepresented the Bayesian thing again. It's not really that it's like it's more probable, so I believe it more. It's more like w- something being more probable, like just the content of that, like the content of something having, like, let's say there's some proposition has a 90% probability. That's just saying that you as a person are 90% sure it's true. Like, that's what Bayesian probability is about. Whereas, like, another one would be like, if something has a 90% probability of being true, it means that in observed, from all the observed data that we have, it has observed 9 times out of 10. Like, it has happened 9 times out of 10. Does that make sense? Like, because it kind of matters for the sake of the argument. Because if you're saying like that, like we have the probability of something being true, and there's a 99.999% of it being true, and the free will is the small percentage of it not being true. It sounds that would mean that free will is doubt, right? So any degree to which we doubt something, we were not sure that it's true, that's free will. And that sounds like free will isn't metaphysical then, it's something in our heads, right?
No, that's a great point. No, I so then I guess I would have to say that it would be the frequency then, right? Because
Mm.
if I were to go with the other example, the Bayesian example, then I would be saying, well, free will is a perception, and then you could say, well, it might be predetermined that you have that perception, and then I would
Sure.
honestly, I'd be able to see the point if you could prove some through some sort of like evolution or something else that it is more advantageous for us as organisms to believe that we have free will in order to solicit more likelihood of survivability. But even then, more likelihood of survivability implies that there's some sort of free will within the system that we're counteracting against. We're counteracting the probability of things happening through certain actions within the mind or certain actions through evolution. And therefore, there would be free will somewhere because we're counteracting a different outcome. As long as there are as long as there are differing outcomes within a system, I think you could argue that there's a free will within that system.
Hmm. Okay, so you're saying that your view of free will is that it's the degree to which something is whatever. Interesting, interesting. So when you throw a ball up in the air and you say there's a high probability of this, going on this particular trajectory, but then there's like this kind of probability. distribution of it falling in any of the surrounding like inch or something like that, right? You're saying that free will is in that surrounding inch and in the probability of it falling in that surrounding inch. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that that would be a proper conclusion. Yeah, the free will exists on the fringe of the system, really.
Yes. Okay. So just to be clear, if we said if we switch the proposition to being the chance that it does not fall in that place, um, the proposition being like, okay, so we throw a ball up in the air, there is a 0.001% chance of it not falling in this particular place. You would still take um, free will to be the smaller percentage. It's not about like which order you. It's not about which is the positive part of the proposition. It's about which is the less likely occurrence, right? Maybe you don't
Yes, I think
understand what
that
I'm
is
talking
what I'm saying. Yeah, I feel like that's what I'm saying.
about. Okay, okay. So it sounds to me like free will to you is just like in any circumstance, it's the less likely occurrence is free will, right? So if I flip a weighted coin, like a bullshit weighted coin that I've stuck in the oven for a while, then like the free will is the coin dropping on the lighter side, right? So we're saying that
Right.
so you're saying that the coin has free will because if it didn't have free will, it would always fall on the heavier side. Is that right?
Well, yeah, because I would say that free will is undermined by the ability to predict the outcomes of things. That's what I feel like we were saying earlier. So, like, when you can predict the outcomes of things with more accuracy, then it provides evidence to suggest that free will doesn't exist.
Wait,
So
but now
every
it sounds.
time in which it is that evidence is undermined by an alternative occurrence outside of the predictability of an action, that is the presence of free will.
Um, wait, but are you when you say like free will is the smaller probability? Are you just saying that there's a correlation? Like, are you just saying that like the
Yeah,
are
it might
you
be phrased
actually
that poorly.
is it actually identity? Like, are you actually saying that that's what free will is, or are you saying there's a relationship between free will and that occurrence?
Relationship. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Okay, okay, okay.
I was making an absolute claim while trying to reference a relationship too.
So
It's
what is the
yeah,
relationship that you're talking about?
so the relationship would be that if we're looking at things through the particular lens of attempting to prove one exists over the other, or that one absolutely does not exist, as long as we are looking at it through the lens of saying, well, we can prove determinism is more likely if we can predict the outcomes of certain interactions, then whenever it is that that prediction is undermined by something within the system without the presence of alternative factors, that occurrence would undermine the evidence that suggests that determinism exists. So the relationship is that unlikely outcomes
Hmm,
or outcomes that exist outside of predictability are in relationship to the
interesting.
existence of free will.
That's a good point. Anytime we make a prediction about something and it we don't meet that prediction, it's more likely that there's that kind of free will. That's a good point. That it's the same kind of evidence. Um, as long as we're talking about brains, like as long as it's about the probability of things happening in brains. Because if we're talking about things outside of brains, then it's not relevant to like free will in a human mind, but it might be relevant to free will of like the coin flip or something if you're talking about that kind of thing. But I think
Yeah,
I
well,
understand
because
what
you
you're saying.
said that it was much more complex for me to claim that the human mind is the only thing that has free will. So I would say, which it's not that wasn't the claim that I was trying to make in the first place. But to your point, the claim that
Yeah.
only the human mind has free will is much more complex and nuanced than the claim that free will exists somewhere in the system. So then, if I can say, well, the occurrence of this thing happening is evidence of free will existing in some capacity within the system, then that hypothesis becomes much more simple and therefore much more likely. And that's just Occam's razor.
Hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Uh, Yeah, so anytime we observe. Yep. Okay, sure. Okay, I understand. But the original point of the question was for me to like start. I'm trying not to talk about the probabilities anymore. I'm trying to
Right.
now attack the very concept. So could you explain to me more about the concept? Like I get what you're saying. Like sure, the probabilities, it's counter evidence, sure. But like what's your conception of free will?
So I'll use the easiest one that I can think of is probably because it's the one I use the most frequently is going to be like the idea of free will that I have based off of like the religious beliefs that I hold. So I would say under my system, right? I don't want to necessarily have the like a huge debate about this particular claim. I'm just trying to give you a better example of like what my definition would be. Under my religious beliefs, the outcome of all existence has some sort of determined instance. It is ultimately going to have completed the will of God, right? So the grand narrative of the Bible, the grand narrative of creation is that it will complete or bring to fruition the will of God.
Hmm.
But within that system, there are an infinite number of factors that could occur that would not
Yeah,
uh,
of course. Yeah.
undermine the outcome. But
Hmm.
it's still an infinite number of factors as far as we are concerned. So
Yeah.
if if it's an infinite number of factors as far as we can tell based off of any amount of knowledge that we could acquire, then there's no reason for us to say that it isn't free will, because ultimately we're still choosing things like you said earlier within a room.
Hmm. Yeah. So the room that you say is that it's all going to end up at some point being free will. Now, when you say like at that determined state of God's kind of will, are you talking about some point in the future, or are you talking about every outcome?
I don't necessarily know. I would think it would be every outcome, personally. I would say that it's like it's inevitable, kind of in the same way that a force of nature might be inevitable. Um, but like like I said earlier, I'm not saying that aren't any predetermined factors, just that there is the presence of free will in some capacity. And that the
Yeah.
presence of free will doesn't have to, or isn't, it's not necessary that free will undermines the outcome for free will to still exist.
Okay, so my original conception of what you were saying was that God has this plan, this kind of end point. You could say like Rome, and then you've got multiple roads that lead to Rome. You've got many infinite ways that humanity could progress towards this final state that God wills. That God wills. Now that was my conception, and this makes sense to me. However, if you're saying that every discrete outcome, every granular, small, tiny outcome is uh, is that predetermined state, right? Then you're saying that every outcome is predetermined. Like what there must be a cutoff point. There must be some small scale things that aren't predetermined. Otherwise, you're saying that literally everything is predetermined, and I can't understand how you could say that there's free will if everything is determined.
Um, well, so if we were to look at my ontology of God, I would say God exists outside of logic, and there's like a whole different discussion I think to be had with that particular thing that some people find fruitful and some people find completely useless. But
Hmm.
um, in regards to this specific aspect of free will, uh, sim- um, gosh, I keep on losing my train of thought. I apologize. So free the granular outcomes of things, I guess the way to phrase it, it's impossible to undermine the outcome of the system that God has created with any infinite number of actions, right? So because I could do anything that exists within the possible realm of conceivability and it would not undermine the
Yeah.
outcome, that means that I still have free will within the system. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily that it's all predetermined to solicit a certain outcome. Any number of things will solicit that outcome. The outcome is
Yes.
inevitable. But all of
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
granular decisions within that system, free will still, because
Yes.
it's just impossible to undermine the outcome. We think of the word of plan as if like X plus Y, therefore Z. But that's just not the way that it works with that particular plan. The plan is inevitable. It's just therefore Z, right? We could consider it as uh, integer x plus integer y equals z. And like I said earlier, the only possible way to do that with an infinite number of integers would be with the number zero, or would be if x and y both equal 0. Because it'd be 0 plus 0 equals 0, right? But that ultimately is the way in which the plan operates. But I still have all of the infinite number of integers that could occur within that system. It's just when filtered through the conditions of existence facilitated by God, they end up soliciting that inevitable outcome. But it's that those things are filtered through God, not filtered through the actions or the things within our contingencies of existence or conditions of
So
existence.
I'm just sorry. Are you saying that literally anything could happen and it would still be part of God's plan? Is that what you're saying or not?
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Literally anything. Like, okay.
Literally anything.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. So that's a very wide room then.
It's
Hmm.
a huge fucking room. Yeah.
Yeah. So now the thing is that as far as I can see, this would not be a there is no room, and so it seemed like there is no particular state that God's looking for. Because of course, if you allow for anything to happen, then there's an infinite number of there's well, not infinite, but there's a huge number of possible outcomes. And it sounds like you're saying that all of those outcomes are the discrete state that God is willing into existence. Like all of them. Like all of them are God's plan, right? But those are a lot of different plans, many of them that are quite opposite to one another. Some of them would have all humans being confined in virtual reality hells with artificial intelligence overlords, and some of them would have, us be living in pretty, heaven on earth like states. Um, how could those things both be God's plan?
Yeah, so I think that part of the issue that I run into when advocating for this particular like definition of free will, or within religious circles, is just like I don't want to be pedantic. I don't know how familiar you are. It's like Calvinism versus I can't remember the other word, but Calvinism says everything's predetermined, and then the other religious view says that everyone has free will. And so I run into
Mm-hmm.
this a lot. Not to lean on linguistic functions, right? But like ultimately, like I said, I think I was saying this earlier. Um, all plans imply certain things. Plans imply that there are a number of factors that contribute to a particular outcome. And what I'm trying to say is that for us to apply that word to God's plan isn't proper. It's just that ultimately the only way by which I can attempt to describe what it is that will occur is through the word plan. It's the only linguistic function that I have to say
I'm
X, Y, Z will solicit uh, B or A or whatever, right? So I don't have any other linguistic function by which to describe that,
Hmm.
but
It
ultimately
sounds
that is the way it is.
See, it sounds
In my
more like to me that you're saying that God creates starting functions and doesn't care where they go. That's what it sounds like from what you described. Because he's not selecting starting conditions so that they lead to a particular outcome. He's selecting starting conditions so that they lead to any number of outcomes, like many, 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 many possible outcomes, like so many possible outcomes,
so
right?
I get what you're saying here. I think when you referenced earlier, those were material outcomes. I'm speaking more to the idea of metaphysical outcomes. So it's
Okay,
like,
categorical sort
right.
of outcomes. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, yeah, yeah. So I wouldn't say that it's like um, that God's plan is for us to end up, in this heaven that looks this particular way that is modeled after this particular aspect of Earth, and blah 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 blah. Like, no,
Yeah.
ultimately, it would be that the outcome is perhaps a oneness of the universe in some capacity, which is achieved through an infinite number of possibilities.
Entropy. Like, yeah. Or
Sorry?
like
Question mark?
entropy, or like maybe just people making their own decisions. Because like that, to me, that seems like it could be God's plan. Like, okay, it's God's plan for everybody to have their own decisions and just to choose their own decisions. And it leads to it doesn't matter what it leads to. The plan is for people to be in this circumstance. Like, for example, like communists. like you have a communist plan or whatever, a plan to have this government, but the state it's just about making these starting conditions, and then the plan is for people to govern themselves in this kind of sort of way, but it's not, the plan isn't for some particular future outcome, right? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to phrase it. Yeah, the plan isn't that it isn't for a particular outcome of like certain conditions. It's just a general metaphysical plan.
Yeah, okay. um I see. And so I'm just curious. So that I understand then that what the God's plan relation is. Then my question is, what? How does how does the free will work? So I guess my first question uh, is are the decisions made by humans predetermined, or are they random, or are they neither, or both?
I would say they're both, but like we mentioned earlier, the idea of randomness is kind of an ad hoc critique um, of that action. So we would perceive it as random externally, being observers of the phenomena. We would say, oh well, that was random, right?
Yes.
Or if we look at it mathematically, we would say, oh, this integer was not supposed to occur within this particular system, and we would say it's random. But that's just the
Hmm.
definition that we're using. So I would say that yes, there is a randomness, but there are things that exist um, outside of systems that we currently have knowledge of that occur within the system that we have knowledge of. So
Oh,
certain
okay.
people will do certain things that would be outside of the system that they would have been introduced to. So I think a good example of this are like the rags to riches stories that we hear about every now and then, right? Where it's like
Hmm.
somebody is born under, and I know we didn't want to talk about probabilities or behavior, so I'm trying to keep this as vague as possible because I think it's applicable. So someone is born under the conditions of poverty, right? They grow up observing poverty almost exclusively. And so, if we were to look at the system in which that thing operates, it's operating within the system of specific learned behaviors that preclude it to participate in the activity of poverty. But there are instances in which individuals who have all those predispositions, who would have probably not seen, or it is unlikely for them to have seen any kind of behaviors that would have solicited wealth for them. There
Hmm.
are instances in which those individuals are able to achieve wealth. And we would look at those and say they're random, but within the system that they're occurring, they're completely outside of the system. So I wouldn't call them random, right? And that's I'm kind of taking like a bit of a metaphysical definition and combining it with like an empirical type thing. It would be like if 1 plus 1 equaled z, I think would be the best way to compare it mathematically. But we can see that that occurs within human behavior if we look at our basic understandings of psychology and say, well, children are just mirrors, children are just sponges, and it is completely unlikely that they would exhibit a behavior outside of the system in which they were raised. Yet we have examples in which people and individuals have done that. And I would say that we could look at physical objects and likely find similar relationships.
Um, hmm. Okay. So they are human decisions are determined depending on which system you're looking at, and they are random depending on which system you're looking at, which sort of perspective you're looking at it from. Is that what you're saying?
Kind of, yeah, but I would say that there exists a thing outside of randomness as well. That's what I was trying to say by the by saying 2 plus 2 equals a, right? Or x plus,
Hmm.
or sorry, the imaginary number I plus the imaginary number I equals 2. Like
Hmm.
it's a conclusion that exists somewhat outside of the system that we would typically say that it exists in, but it still occurs, and that would be not random.
Hmm. Okay. Um,
So I was just trying to say, I think I added an unnecessary bit of metaphysic that I hold. What I'm trying to say is, yes, I would say that there exists things that are predetermined and things that are random.
hmm. Both. Okay. Now, so like So a person, so are you saying that some decisions are random and others are determined?
Yeah. Yeah, I think some
Okay.
decisions are, but like I said before, random is a perspective. Random is a property that we apply afterwards.
Okay, so what is it metaphysically then? If it's what the things which we call random, what is it metaphysically?
It would be an occurrence of an integer that exists outside of the system in which you are operating in. So if I'm operating in a
Yeah.
system of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, well, now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10. And that then when we look back at the system, we would say, well, the system is supposed to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, but what's this 10? Oh, well,
Hmm.
now we've got this random thing in here. But within the system itself, you're pulling from another system.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
You wouldn't
I
have even
see that.
conceived to exist, perhaps.
Okay. 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 So then when we say random, then I want to like when we say random, we're not just talking about what the current state of knowledge is. We're talking about what is theoretically possible for a person to know or to understand, or for some agent to understand or know, given the system
Right.
they're in. Does that make sense?
Right.
Are we on the same page there?
Yeah. Yeah, we
Yeah.
are.
Um, so then you're saying that some human decisions are determined, which means that they're kind of enclosed within the system we're in, and others are random, which means they seem to be random, which just means that the causes for them come from a different system. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Okay.
think that would be the best way for us to try to describe it.
Now, what are the systems that we're talking about here? Is the first system the universe, the observable universe? Can we say that?
I think I'd be comfortable with that. Yeah.
Okay. So if the system so then anything that's kind of explainable and understandable theoretically within the observable universe would be considered determined, and other things would be considered quote unquote random. And those things would be things where the causes for them uh, they have their origin in a system that exists outside of or encloses the observable universe, right?
Yeah. So, like the room, the things that exist outside of the things within the room, right? Is that what you're saying?
Fuck, what? God damn it!
No.
I totally understood until then.
So you're saying that you could say the system is the observable universe, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But the observable universe exists within the wider expanse of the entire universe, the entire universe being the room in which we can operate. So
yes,
we would
perfect.
exist within
Yes,
the
true.
room. Yes, we would exist within the room of the observable universe. Free
Which is
will
within
would
the
be,
room of the universe.
yeah, free will would be the existence of integers outside of the observable universe that have been brought into the observable universe. So they go from
Yeah.
being
So they're the things that they're the actions we can take, and the fact well, free will to you then is the fact that we can take actions that aren't understandable within the observable universe,
that would be one kind of free will. Yes, one particular kind of free.
or actions rather that are like you're able to take actions that aren't offered by the observable universe. They're offered by they're not possible if you were only existing and you could only take the possible actions from the observable universe. But because you can select your actions from this wider room that is the entire universe, now you can take those actions. And that means that we have free will, right? That's one kind
Yeah.
of free will, as you're saying.
Hold on 1 second, man. I have to pick something up real quick. Hold on just a second.
Yep.
Sorry about that.
No, no trouble.
Thank you for your patience. I appreciate that. So you were saying that the presence of these things outside of the system in which we exist, when they become present in the system in which we exist, that is indicative of the presence of free will, because we're pulling from things outside of the system that would otherwise confine us. Was that what you were saying?
That's what I take your like conception of free will to be so far. Yeah.
Yes. I would say that that is one of the properties under which I would say free will exists. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. Um, so then, really, I mean, the question is, do we in fact have that ability to pull actions from that outer universe? And does the universe even exist? So I guess if we can only observe things within the observable universe, then obviously there can't possibly be any evidence for the outer universe. So the only possible you don't have any evidence, right? So then the only thing to consider would be the prior probabilities, and the prior probability of there being this universe is much more complex than the probability of that universe just not existing, right?
So are you asking if I have any proof of things existing outside of the observable universe in order to back up the claim that that would be a part of the definition of free will?
Well, actually, I was claiming that you couldn't possibly do that, but if you think I'm wrong about that, then go ahead. It just seems to me that it's part of the definition of observable universe, but maybe that's not how you're using it. I don't know.
So I would say that there's two options here as to whether or not there exists evidence to suggest that there is something that exists outside of the observable universe. We could
Mhm.
either conclude that as we learn new things about the universe, that it simply is that our powers of observance have increased, and that therefore it would just be that our understanding of what is the observable universe is expanding. I would say that that in itself doesn't necessarily preclude us from the idea that there are things that exist outside of our universe, because it could be that if we were to look at it, like take the metaphor, make it literally, think of ourselves as acquiring knowledge and expanding that sphere of what is observable. Now our sphere has expanded, therefore the observable universe has expanded into things that existed outside of what was observable. So technically, we are acquiring things that were outside of observable, because observable is not an absolute constant.
Yeah.
Observable is a fluctuating concept that describes all the things present within the universe versus all the things that we can observe within it. So when we
Right.
observe something that we had not previously observed, now we've expanded our universe into other portions of the universe that were previously unobservable. But it doesn't mean that they didn't exist, or that they already existed within what was observable. We've just become able to observe them. So now our observable universe is expanded.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, this is why I wanted to clarify if you meant like theoretically observable, or if you meant currently observed and known, right? So now it sounds like you're using observable universe to mean currently observed and known, as opposed to theoretically observable. So it sounds like you're not necessarily saying that anything exists um, that isn't theoretically knowable.
Yeah, and I had two points that I was gonna. I can't remember what the second one was. I
I don't know.
apologize because I got a little excited over the way that I was thinking about the first one, and I may have missed your question earlier about am I talking about theoretical or am I talking about like the like actually observable.
Yeah, yeah,
So I
yeah.
do apologize. I had a little bit of a technological issue for half a second there, but
Okay, so
um,
correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying when you say the observable universe, you do not mean theoretically observable. You mean currently observed, or
um,
current like we currently have the capacities for observing it.
I would say that there is more evidence to suggest that the second, or not more evidence, I would say that the second one is more likely to solicit a satisfactory outcome for my argument. Um, the first one, theoretically observable universe, as in as we learn new things, as we observe more things, it was that they were always existed within the observable universe. Then how is it that I would go about proving that there exist things outside of that observable universe? I would say that's not necessarily possible unless you want to look at like experiential claims as being or some quantum physics claims as being substantial enough to evidence that other universes exist or other conditions of existence exist.
Yeah, I agree. So you're going with the second then?
I think I have to.
Okay. Sure. Um, Gotta hold on to being plausibly correct as long as possible, yeah. Um,
Is that the point of
so
debate?
I guess so, yeah. Okay, so you're saying that for something to be determined means that we currently understand how we can currently determine it. Like it's currently determined. We currently know how to predict it. And things are random if we don't currently know how to predict them. And so free will is something happens that we don't know how to predict yet.
Yeah, well, and I would say that ultimately there's really no other way, or I would argue there's no other way to determine that things are determined outside of predictability. Because if I can't predict the outcome of something, then all I'm doing is ad hoc saying that it was determined. All I'm doing is saying that these integers added up to this thing. Well, of course they fucking did. Because that's what they were going to add, or that's what they added up to, because we're watching the solution. We're not actively a part of the equation. The only way to say that things are absolutely determined would be that we could absolutely predict all things.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but by this definition of free will, you would say that back in the day, right, when we didn't know how the planets moved at all, someone would see the planet moving, and you would say that at that time, the planet moving was free will, but it's no longer has free will because now we understand it, right?
No, I wouldn't say that the planet ever had free will necessarily. I think because I'm not saying that like our observance of things or like our understanding of them is what necessarily dictates them as having free will. What I'm saying is that we can't say that things were determined unless we can predict their outcome.
No,
Because
no,
if
okay,
we're
sure.
just looking at things in reverse and saying that they became a certain way because of these previous factors, then ultimately that's not sufficient evidence to suggest that free will doesn't exist within that system because we're not able to accurately predict the outcome. And like we were talking about earlier, when things are more simple, it's easier to predict the outcome of them. And when we can predict the outcome of them, we can therefore conclude that they are predetermined or that they are determined. But if we cannot predict the outcome of things, then they're not determined. So as long as the ability exists in which we cannot predict the outcomes of things, I would say that free will is unarguably present until we can accurately say that we can predict the outcomes of all things.
Okay, so that sounds to me like exactly like what you're claiming is that free will varies in inverse proportion to our understanding of things.
Our perception of free will varies. Yeah. Yeah. I would say metaphysically, I don't think that it is the case that we will ever be able to predict the outcomes of all things. I just think that's impossible. And I would say that, like, even when we look at causal chains now, there's an infinite number of factors which went into the conclusions of certain things. So World War II occurred for an infinite number of reasons, not for a finite number of reasons. And as long as there are an infinite number of factors that contribute to something, it's impossible for us to say that, well, if we could replicate all of these things, these infinite number of things, then we would replicate this particular situation. But the number of things to replicate would be infinite. So we can't do it. It's not possible. So therefore, free will exists somewhere in that system because the thing that comes out of it has an infinite number of possibilities because it's an infinite number of influences. Am I still on track here? Am I staying on the right train of thought, or am I going off into la la land again?
I think we're on roughly the same track. So okay, so you're saying that the perception of free will varies in inverse proportion to our understanding of things. But you're saying that you believe that free will itself exists by virtue of there being some protected, something that some You just don't think that you will ever understand everything, and so there'll be something that we can never predict, and therefore that thing has free will. Is that correct?
That could be one possible conclusion. Yeah, I can
Well,
agree to that.
is that
But it would work for the sake of my argument, because as long as one thing in the system has free will, then free will exists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I guess the thing is, like, so let's say we know that there can be the perception of free will in the way that you're describing free will without there being free will, because like we've seen that there would be the perception of free will in the movement of the planets without there being free will, right? So the perception of free will does not imply the existence of free will. So if we at some point fail to understand everything, we just can't. We get to a point and there's some protected class of things that we can't understand, that we can't predict things about. Um, that means that there's the perception of free will, but that doesn't mean that there is free will, right?
I mean, I guess for the sake of that particular argument, yeah, that would be the case. But I think what I'm saying is that the only way by which you can determine if something is determined is if you can predict it. So as long as you
Yeah.
can't predict it, then you can't suggest that it doesn't have free will. That's not a substantial claim.
Well, it's not clear to me that like determinism and free will are directly opposites. It seems to me that free will is a subset of the possibilities if determinism isn't true, but it's not all of the possibilities. So I believe that there are ways of supporting that free will is not the case without supporting that determinism is the case. Does that make sense?
There are ways of supporting free will not being the case without suggesting determinism is the case.
That's
Is that
right.
what I heard?
Yes.
There are ways. Oh, so you would say that we're looking at it as a false dichotomy. We're looking at it as it's either
Yeah.
absolutely determined or absolutely free will, but it doesn't, or if we can't prove one, it doesn't mean that or if we can prove one, it doesn't mean that the other one exists absolutely.
Yeah, kind of like if it may be the case that I can't fathomably uh, propose any evidence in favor of um, determinism, but I can still say that free will definitely isn't going on without talking about determinism at all, because there are other possibilities besides these two things. Because free will is not simply just things happen which aren't determined. It sounds to me like the claim is more complex than that. It sounds like it's there are things that uh, well, I mean, maybe it is just that. Is it just that? Is that the extent of the free will thing? Just if something isn't determined, then it's free will, or
Yeah, I would have to say that that is the particular way in which I would be operating, and that it's a binary relationship. If it
okay,
isn't
okay,
determined, then it is some form of free will.
interesting. Well, I
Which is
guess
why
I
it makes
yeah.
it extra.
So then I don't grant that there's no way of supporting determinism other than by showing that something is, other than predicting some outcomes. There are other ways of increasing the probability of the proposition. For example, by decreasing the probability of a mutually exclusive option, right? By saying that it's impossible or less likely that free will exists, in virtue of them being mutually exclusive, you increase the probability that determinism is the case by the same amount, right?
Say that one more time.
Well, you were
Didn't
claiming
quite.
earlier that the only way that you could like provide evidence of determinism would be by predicting things. Like it's necessarily tied to predictability, But that's not the case because I can, if I show counter evidence for free will, then that serves as positive evidence for determinism and doesn't have anything to do with predictability.
Well, what kind of evidence would you be showing in that particular instance?
Well, like for example, I could say that your conception of free will is it's just impossible uh, for it to exist. Like it's impossible for it's inconceivable for something to um, uh, if like I could show that. Uh, yeah, no. If you define free will as being literally just not determined, then it is basically just about whether or not it's just about predictability. But you've said a lot of things that make me think that that's not the case. But because like you're arguing about it being uh, about there being a like you said earlier that it wasn't random in the sense that like there is no cause. You were saying that like the causes just exist outside of our understanding, right? Like there's just things that we don't understand how they work, but they still work in a particular way, right? So that means to me that like they're not um, they're not random. There's something going on there, and if they're not random, then that means that like if free will excludes randomness, then your definition of free will must not be entirely um, it must not be the only other option than determinism because there's always the option of randomness. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think that I tried to account for that by saying that free will exists on a spectrum. So it's not that it's like absolute libertarian free will is the only way in which free will occurs. Free will occurs in a myriad of different ways. I could say that free will occurs in the instance where um, I have a proclivity for a certain behavior and I choose not to participate in that behavior. That could in itself be free will because I've counteracted the proclivity that I would have to participate in that particular kind of behavior. That would be an instance of free will. Now,
Okay, well,
it might be that
if
there are a
that's
number of
if that's free will, then yeah, of course, free will exists. I just that's not the way in which I've heard anybody talk about free will, but yeah, I guess so. Like
right. Well,
obviously, people have proclivities for certain things, but they don't do them. But that's because they have like other proclivities in the opposite direction. And there's a bunch of things like particular. There might be a
right.
stereotype in a particular direction, but there's things that actually are in the particular circumstance that cause them to do the other thing, right?
No, and I would agree completely. That's Hume writes on that. Like I was just brushing up on him before we had this discussion. So
Hmm.
Hume writes about that. That's the antecedent occurrences, right? It would be that it might be that I have a 90% likelihood to engage in X behavior, but I also have a 70% likelihood to engage in Y behavior, a 30% likelihood to engage in T behavior, et cetera, so on and so forth. And I ultimately end up choosing from within those number of options. But ultimately, the act of choosing from within those options is the act of free will, the act of choice, right? So just because I have a limited number of ways in which I can choose to behave doesn't preclude the existence of free will. It just precludes the existence of infinite possibilities, which I don't have a problem with because I don't think that there needs to be completely infinite possibilities within human systems and within our conditions of existence in order for there to be free will.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I worry that we might be going around in a circle now, but I don't. It doesn't seem to me that there's like I don't see how you could say that we're choosing from among the options, the 90%, the 70%, the 30%. Like those percentages are like probability, no matter how you spin it, is just a human construct about how we um, about our it's something that we produce based on the data that we have available, right? But in every formulation of probability about like at least about phenomena uh, like most phenomena, probability is just a stand-in for understanding the situation, right? Like you wouldn't um, you just because we just because we as observers don't know what's going to happen doesn't mean that there's more than one possibility, if that makes sense, like metaphysically.
Yeah, but I would say that that would fall into the instance of being ad hoc again, because we're taking things that we were observing having occurred and then applying the system that we understand them to exist within afterwards, because we aren't predicting.
No, I mean, like let's say you make a prediction, like you throw a ball in the air and you predict where it's going to go, and
Right.
then you make a prediction with like 90% certainty or something that it's going to go there. There's two things that you think might happen, and it goes in the 10% off, right? It goes in the way that you didn't think it was going to go. Like that doesn't mean there was any possibility of it going in the 90% route, right? Like
Well, the possibility still exists,
I
right?
don't
It's
think I don't
the
agree though.
90% possibility of going into the that particular spot. It had 90% likelihood it was going to go there. It had a 10% likelihood that it was going to go someplace else.
Yeah, I don't
But like,
grant that. I don't grant that. Like I think like the person observing assigned it a 90% likelihood of going there, but it in fact had a 100% likelihood of going in the place that it actually went, right?
right, but that
If
would
you're
be
talking,
because you believe that the outcome of throwing the ball in the air was determined to land in the 10% predictability range.
yeah,
Correct?
I'm just saying that like we're basically just giving each other like contradictory claims here, right? Like when you say that there's a 90%, 70%, and a 30% chance of these things occurring, um, I don't I don't understand why. I'm just saying that I don't grant that. I'm not saying that I have like proof that it's not that. It's just that I don't see why you think that there is a choice there.
Why I think that there is a choice there.
Yeah, but again, I'm just doing the like you can't prove it, so it's wrong thing. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying I don't see why you would.
I mean, I did the same thing to you earlier. Prove it
Sure.
doesn't
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, I would say that I would lean back to that statement that I made earlier about there existing things outside of systems that are pulled into the system that we're operating in. So it might be that you've predicted that the ball is going to do a certain thing, and then it does the thing that is counterintuitive to the thing that you predicted it to doing, and that in some way is drawing in from a factor that exists outside of the system that we're currently in, and because it drew a factor from outside of the existence that we are currently in or bound to, it acted in a way that was free will because it acted outside of the system that we're acting in.
But now your conception of free will is like this weird like human dependent, like mind dependent thing where it's like whether or not you have free will is dependent on the psychologists that are thinking about what you're going to do, right? Like what system they're thinking about. That determines whether or not you have free will.
Well, for the particular instance of like human behavior, but I would say that like there also could be instances um, in which there are particular particles that are existing or doing things or having behaviors that are outside of what we would consider to be like observable or outside of what we consider to be reasonable.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
you,
okay, sure. I
you
listen,
only
like
there.
if we're saying that basically like it's free will is this kind of epistemic thing where you assign a probability and free will exists in the fact that from your perspective exists a possibility like an epistemic possibility that it will not that your prediction will be wrong, um, like your uncertainty of your prediction is free will in on the part of the thing that's being observed, then I do grant your proposition. However, this is not free will by like any metric I've ever heard of. like, like when people talk about free will, they're talking about usually agents having an ability to actually metaphysically have like a counterfact, like an ability to perform some counterfactual action. Like they were able to take multiple choices as opposed to an observer not being sure what's going to happen, right?
Yeah. So you're saying that just because it's not predictable doesn't mean that it's evidence to suggest that free will exists, because it's just the limitation of our ability to predict, not that it's a statement about the system.
Well, the way it sounded is that you were saying that free will, it just is whenever uh somebody's like whenever something happens that isn't um what we thought was going to happen, that is free will. Like necessarily, that is free will. So that leads me to believe that that's like by definition. So like it sounds to me like you're saying that free will is is just what we mean by free will is something happened that was not expected, or the free will is the possibility for something to happen that we don't expect, right?
I apologize. I
Because
would say
because
it's
otherwise I can't
evidence
see how it would
to
follow.
suggest.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I would just say it's evidence when something exists outside of predictability or occurs outside of
Oh,
predictability.
oh,
It's
okay.
evidence to suggest that free will exists.
Hmm. Hmm.
Until we can otherwise prove that it's 100% predictable. At which point it would cease to be evidence for free will and become evidence for determinism.
Hmm. So if you say if you make a prediction and it comes out incorrect, like your prediction was wrong, then this is evidence for the hypothesis that things um, uh, that things are not determinable, or that things are not causally determined. It's also evidence. I suspect that's also evidence for something on the other side of the argument. Let's see. Is it evidence for? Is it evidence for something causing causing it that we don't understand, right? Like so there's a
A
hypothesis.
predetermined
Yeah,
factor that we haven't identified.
yeah. So there's like it's evidence for there not being any factors and for it not being caused, but it's also evidence for us just having done the prediction incorrectly, right?
Yeah. Well, and I mean that would be ridiculous for me to say that just because we're ill-equipped that necessitates the existence of free will. I would say
Hmm.
as soon as it is that we are well equipped and can predict something accurately, we can now undermine with absolute certainty the existence of free will. But
And
so
and
long as we are
therefore,
unable to do that, right, and so long as we're unable to do that, the possibility and the likelihood of free will is much more substantial.
well, here's the thing though. Like so here's a theorem of probability theory, right? Like if I think we might have already talked about this in the God discussion, but you if you if A is evidence for B, then not A is evidence for not B. Um, like so if I say that something is evidence, so if you say like in the hypothetical circumstance where uh, we have all of this predictive power, and we then predict something and it comes out being correct, you're saying that that's evidence for determinism. Well, therefore, um, in the future, if we had that predictive power and we made a uh, we made some prediction and it turned out being wrong, that would be very strong evidence that determinism is not the case, right? Agreed?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So conversely, now when we don't have evidence, right? When we don't have that evidence, uh, us observing, uh, I'm kind of doing this in a roundabout way. But I guess the more pertinent question to ask is just like, what makes you think that it's more likely in our current state that free will exists?
I would honestly, I mean, I feel like it's not a super strong argument, so I do apologize in advance for those people who are in the room or hoping for a super strong argument. I would say that there's nothing in our current understanding of the world that indicates that there is substantial evidence that all things are able to be predicted. And if all things are not able to be predicted, then we cannot conclude that determinism exists, because we can't conclude determinism exists unless we can accurately predict the outcomes of all possible things. So I would say that because our understanding of science, our understanding of physics, our understanding of quantum physics is ever expanding, it is the case that we're constantly running into the issue of, well, this isn't predictable, or this is predictable, or this has a seemingly infinite number of factors that would make it predictable, and an infinite number of factors that could make it unpredictable. And when we can control those factors, it becomes predictable. But there's no evidence to suggest that that is the way that everything behaves in every instance, because we can't prove it. We can only prove it under certain conditions.
Well, the thing is, though, right, is that if you say that it's like not possible for us to find evidence currently, right? If it's not currently possible for us to find evidence in support of determinism, then it's not currently possible for us to find evidence in support of free will.
Yeah, but I feel like we already established at the beginning of the discussion where we both said there's really no way to provide absolute evidence for either of these things.
Well, not any evidence. The thing is, it's not even, you can't have any evidence. It's not about proof. It's like you can't have any evidence. You can't even increase the probability.
I would say you can increase the probability either way, and therefore draw a logical conclusion based off of the probability. But I would say that you can't come to an absolute conclusion just yet.
Yeah.
Perhaps there is an instance in which we will be able to, but I've outlined the condition. I feel like I've outlined the conditions under which I would cede that point, right? If we could have the ability to predict everything at all times, every outcome in every situation, then we could say, well, it's determined because it's predictable. And there might be science that suggests that that is the case. Well, if I can control XYZ within XYZ, or sorry, if I can control XYZ within this particular experiment, then why wouldn't I be able to do that with all of these other things if I had an infinite amount of time to observe an infinite number of things and apply an infinite number of factors into this? But infinite means never ending. Like, that's the core meaning of the word. So it would mean that it's never ending, which would mean that there's always variables that exist outside of it. So I would say that in itself suggests that it's impossible, and therefore the conclusion is that statistically it's more likely that there is some existence in some form of free will within the system.
Damn it! I zoned out. So I zoned out. So what do you think? What is the evidence in support? What makes it more likely statistically for there to be free will?
So I was saying I would be swayed that free will didn't exist if we could predict the outcome of all things, right? Everything, we could predict the outcome of all things. But in order to predict the outcome of all things, I would need to have a seemingly infinite amount of time in which to apply a seemingly infinite number of factors to a seemingly infinite number of things to generate this seemingly infinite number of outcomes. And because the very concept is infinite, as in like never ending, I would say that under that definition, using the word infinite, that definition would imply that there is always going to be the suggestion that probabilistically there is free will.
There's always, so what it sounds to me is like you're saying that we can't ever prove that determinism is the case, because you're saying it could possibly theoretically be that we have this great predictive power, we do tests, and we determine that free will is the case. That's the only way that we could do it, and that's impossible. So therefore we cannot ever prove that determinism is the case. Therefore there's always some possibility of free will being the case, and therefore you think it's likely, like greater than 50% probability, that free will is the case.
In specific instances, yes. Yeah. And like I said, the prompt originally was, I was hoping that I would get to discuss with, which I don't know where you fall on the spectrum of absolute determinism versus compatibilism versus libertarian free will. I don't know what the ism is for that one, but humism, I don't know. So my thought was that I was interested in proving the likelihood of compatibilism, because I would say that as long as free will exists somewhere within the system, I believe that falls under the compatibilism umbrella. And so, because there is a greater likelihood that free will exists somewhere within the system, it is more likely that compatibilism is the logical conclusion, and therefore free will does exist in some capacity.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So here's the thing. I think I've got to the point where I can't really think of a way to argue in favor of determinism being more likely. So I'm not really. I don't think I'm really capable of holding up my end of the proposition here. But I would say that the argument you've just presented for there being a greater than 50% probability of free will existing is not doesn't hold water. Like you say, like will always be some possibility, so greater than zero possibility that free will is true. Therefore, there is right now a greater than 50% possibility. Like greater than zero, therefore greater than 50. Like what? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I agree. That does make sense, and that is kind of exactly what I've said. So, I would say that we'd have a really hard time. I don't know if you would agree with this or not. We'd have a really hard time quantifying a percentage likelihood of either way. So ultimately, it is going to come down to something that is kind of like a belief-based decision, which I think that's ultimately what the argument of free will comes down to in the first place, is a lot of belief-based decisions. Um, so I would say, um, part of why I would say that free will is more likely is because at least we haven't been able to prove a way in which it would serve us to to think of the existence of free will as a concept and not for it to absolutely exist within the system in some capacity. So I mentioned earlier, if someone could come to me and give an evolutionary reason why it is that our brains have collectively decided that free will as a concept exists and is therefore advantageous in some capacity, because this is a discussion that's been happening for thousands of years. If there is no way for you to prove that to me through some sort of evolutionary function, then I wouldn't see any reason why it wouldn't be the case that it exists in some capacity, because it's collectively observed and collectively discussed. And that's why I hold the belief. But it's a belief, not a fact. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just briefly, it sounds like you're saying that the fact that we have a sensation or a belief in free will, a lot of us, that is evidence that free will exists.
I
Because
mean, it
is that
might not
right?
be substantial evidence. It's substantial evidence from me,
Okay. All
right?
right. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. My take generally is that it's impossible to know whether or not there's free will or determinism, and I I never thought about the probability either way until the start of this debate. So I think we've done some learning here. I really don't know what to think about it. I think there's the probabilities are very washy. I think it's very difficult to assess the particular probabilities, but in most cases, I think you can say on particular instances what is and isn't evidence. And yeah, I would say neither of us have really been able to present any evidence in either direction that really holds water. So I would say at this point, I don't know if free will exists. I don't even have. I wouldn't even know which way to act. I don't know which one is 51%, which one's 49%. Um, so I would just say you can believe whatever floats your boat.
I feel like ultimately that's what a lot of these types of discussions really boil down to, is like it's kind of a belief structure, really, because
Yeah.
we don't have enough empirical data to suggest the existence of either one. And I would say that a lot of the data that's cited to suggest the existence of determinism is insufficient, because it's really observing in system operations external from that system, because we're not operating within the exact contingencies or conditions of that system in which those things occurred. So we're just ad hoc saying, well, it's predictable because it occurred in this particular way. And I would say that that's just not
Yeah,
sound,
I
as
agree.
far as like, yeah. So that to me leans towards my inclination as to why I would think some form of free will exists. Because
Okay.
if we are observing things and attempting to say they're determined based off of an ad hoc critique of
Wow.
a system, then I would say it's more likely that there's something occurring within that system that we're not accounting for because we're doing it ad hoc. And that thing that we're not accounting for is, in my opinion, most likely free will. And I mean, I'm okay with that being my closing statement. I don't know if you wanted
Yeah,
to
sure.
like make any more closing statements or anything like that. We've been going for
Mhm.
2 hours and 10 minutes, so
Yeah.
I'm happy to keep going. But I feel like the
No.
conversation's kind of reached a nice dwindling point.
Yeah. Yeah. Not exactly a rising crescendo, but more like dying out slowly. Yeah. I on that last point, just I mean, this isn't really much of a closing statement. It's just kind of like an addendum, um, saying that the existing arguments for determinism are don't hold water isn't evidence in any form for free will existing. I don't think there's any relation there. But yeah, again, my position is I have no idea if free will exists. I don't think there's. You'd have to do some kind of weird, like very detailed analysis of all the evidence in either direction in order to go tip one way or the other. I don't think it's clear cut at all. So um, yeah, I don't know if anybody wins here because nobody gives any, nobody's given really any evidence for their claim. But we'll see.
Okay, awesome, guys. Thank you both so much for debating. I appreciate it as always. You want to go with the 3-question voting poll?
Yes.
Sounds good.
Oh, yeah, this
So,
was a debate.
what'd you say, Coco?
I said, oh, yeah, this was a debate.
Yeah.
I was enjoying it so much.